what they need to do is get a hold of their state legislators when it comes to Abdullahi and it comes to the Muslim American Society. I haven't seen this anywhere else in the United States. An official who actually works for the most overt version of the Muslim Brotherhood is an elected official in Columbus, Ohio.
Hi again, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Narrative Podcast. Mike Andrews and Aaron Baird joining you today for another busy week at CC.
Nothing going on here.
Nothing going on. We didn't talk about making this part of our news segment today, but we literally launched a new national program today. We probably should at least lead with that.
National Christian Education Network Scholarship Granting Organization launched this week. The Downtown Commission decided not to let us put crosses on the roofs, and there's going to be a lot more to come on that.
Yeah, that's the ultimate teaser right there.
That one is, that one.
We don't want to say too much.
Exactly. We are consulting legal counsel on that as of right now. But my goodness, we're consulting legal counsel on lots of things as an aside. But in terms of like CCV history arc, today's one of the most important days in our organization history because we are officially launching outside the Ohio borders, right?
Yeah.
And we'll be helping millions of kids, Lord willing, all across the country escape the broken public schools on what I believe is the largest evangelism movement at least in my lifetime, and to help so many children get into a full-time Christian school. So really exciting. Probably, yeah. Glad you brought that up. We should lead with that.
My mind as we sit here talking about what are we going to talk about, and I get started like, wait, we didn't even talk about the thing that we did today. That's
why we're all in green right now. I think I'm wearing green. I'm colorblind, so
it's very green.
Very green.
I assure you.
We're all wearing green for OSEN today, and the Christian Education Network broadly. But
well, not to get too technical, we've talked about the federal school choice tax credit before on the program, but this is the $1,700 tax credit that's part of the big beautiful bill that Trump signed and is going to make it a dollar for dollar tax redirection of your money. Starting in January 1, 2027, you'll be able to give $1,700 to a scholarship granting organization of your choice to help kids get a Christian education. It's a really awesome opportunity.
It's massive. It's just like the whole reason we went into this was because it's just like the Ohio program, right? Where, by the end of this year, we'll have done $15 million in scholarships for kids to attend Christian school. Every dollar you give, you get back off of your, in this case, your federal income taxes. On the Ohio one, it's your state income taxes. And it really is the potentiality of allowing children to access schools that were outside of their reach, allowing more schools to start. And the model that we've built here in Ohio has been so successful that we had folks from other states and even supporters from outside of the state come to us and say, hey, would you take this model all over the country? And so this has been cooking for, several months now. And this is really just the beginning of what's going to be a long stretch for CCV and the Christian Education Network to expand and do more work. So it really is historic, I think, for the country, certainly for CCV.
Yeah, censgo.org if you want more information. We've got lots of content on there that you can check out for right now, ways that your school can participate or you can share with people who are interested as they're hearing about this, censgo.org. And we'll, of course, keep you up to date here as we have new things to talk about in regards to
That's right. And shout out to Troy McIntosh. I feel good calling out Troy, who's the executive director of the Christian Education Network, on the podcast, because I know he doesn't listen to it.
It's true.
So I can compliment him without it actually going to his head. So I will say nice things here to his face. I will continue to be quite rude.
And when we've had him on the podcast, it goes to his head because for some reason we get really high listener numbers when he's on, and he thinks that correlation is causation.
I don't know about that.
That should be like rule
exactly.
one. Just basic philosophy and argumentation. That's not true. It's not true. Another story here in Ohio that we wanted to make sure that we covered pertains to work we did at the Statehouse earlier this General Assembly with eliminating diversity, equity, and inclusion from state universities. Well, we saw a report drop this week from Accuracy in Media where in some ways, this isn't surprising.
Right.
Like we knew this was going on, that it's more DEI programs are going covert. They're changing the names to make it seem like they're in compliance with the law, but they're still functionally doing the same thing. And Accuracy in Media, in an undercover video, showed that this was still happening at Bowling Green State University.
Yeah, you hear the arrogance, and Accuracy in Media has done a number of these videos, and I think we've had them on the podcast before. Compliments to them for staying on this this drumbeat, and it shows what we know, that the arrogance inside a lot of these universities to openly flout Ohio law, right? To just ignore what the duly elected representatives of our state have said they want to spend our money on. Again, this is when Donald Trump talks about the deep state, or other folks talk about the deep state, this is what we actually mean, right? There are people who are paid by the taxpayers who don't believe that they are actually responsive to the voters, right? The sense of entitlement in these people, like you see the professor at Bowling Green that's in this video, that thinks that, yeah, we just have an obligation to pay his salary, and then we, as the voters who pay and taxpayers who pay his salary, we need to shut up and let him do what he wants with our money. That's really the bottom line of what folks like him think, and what is the predominant pedagogy in higher ed all across not just Ohio but the nation. Now, does this mean Senate Bill 1 and the ban on DEI in public universities and colleges wasn't a worthwhile bill? No, it absolutely was, because it certainly did shut down a lot of the really overt and really evil programs that you saw going on in these universities. But we said this at the time it was passed. I know Senator Serino knew this, all of the main sponsors. Like, this was the beginning of the battle, certainly not the end, because all of these people who, you're even seeing some stories about, certain programs or degrees being shut down, which are a good thing, but all of the people who were teaching these programs are still there.
Yeah.
Right. It's the same thing as like the trans hospitals with kids, except it's even worse, because they at least can't do these procedures anymore. Those are actually shut down, but the ideologues are still there. Here, the ideologues are still there. And as you heard, they are actively just going about ways of renaming programs, using different words to no longer be, called out for this.
Yeah. Is there anything in the scope of the law that can be done about that? Because a lot of it seems like they're still focusing that on the classroom. And to your point, where SB1 has had success is maybe the public, the expenditures or financial expenditures to do just broad programs beyond the classroom or that type of thing that aren't happening anymore. But is there anything within the academic curriculum that it's going to have an impact on?
So there's a number of things that we think can still be done. Number one, this is where the boards of trustees really matter, right? Because those are the folks appointed by the governor to really ensure these universities are being run in line with state law and in line with the voters' wishes, right? To ensure accountability. That's why these individuals have to be nominated by the governor, go through confirmation. These institutions are so massive, we have so many of them all across the state that it's impossible for the legislature to keep clear eyes on everything going on over there. So number one, the trustees need to start exerting more authority. Number two, though, this is where I believe the state needs to set up more of a robust reporting and accountability mechanism so that when students or faculty or other individuals see state colleges and universities showing the arrogance of this man in this video, those things can be reported. They can be properly punished, properly dealt with, and have the law enforced. This is, again, we say this all the time. It's just like with elections, just like when you pass bills. It's not enough to just pass the bill. Then you also have to get to the enforcement side. And we're seeing there's still lots of enforcement that needs to be done here. Ultimately, though, too, this is where, I'd say twofold. One, Mike, Christians need to be engaging in this area. We need to get more Christian professors in there, but also we need more Christian colleges so families have more options. And to reject this nonsense they're pushing at a place like Bowling Green and going to a place where they're actually going to teach your kid and not indoctrinate them.
Yeah, the tendrils of that ideology are just so deep that it's going to be hard to pull out. And maybe an example of that is what we saw at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where Cole Allen, who's a teacher and professor, decided that he was going to take matters into his own hands and loaded up for Baird, took selfies of himself with how armed he was, and that he was going to go attempt to take Donald Trump's life. And it's the third time in 2 years that we've seen an act like that against the president.
Well, that's I think the most chilling part about this most recent assassination attempt. Again, mind you, Mike, really in our lifetime, the last true presidential assassination attempt was Reagan, right? And I don't remember that, right? I was alive for it, don't remember it. So just to think about, all of the decades with no violence like this, and now in this presidency and in this term, 3 attempts, right? I mean, it really is, it's unreal. But for me, I don't know how you felt about it when you saw it, that there's that first result, that first like sort of chill of, oh my gosh, here we go again. But when I read his manifesto or his letter and you saw his postings, what actually was the scariest thing to me is that this guy's not insane. Mm-hmm. Right? He's not like, and when I say he's not insane, obviously he's crazy. Anybody who's trying to kill someone is crazy. Anybody who's trying to, especially assassinate the president, is stupid, to say the least. But he wrote very coherently, right? He wasn't hearing voices telling him to do this.
No, it was very logical, and I mean that by steps, not in terms of his overall like mental state, but it was like if A, then B, and then C.
Yeah.
I mean, you could follow, okay, if those two things are true, I could see why you would believe that. I don't agree with it.
Right.
But it wasn't just those incoherent ramblings of, this is a person who's off his rocker.
Exactly. No, this guy, very clearly, he was parroting the things that are the sort of common dialect at higher educational institutions today, right? This guy's not a king, that he's a pedophile. I don't know where that one came from. All of the and I can't allow such evil to be done in art. Like all of those like basic talking points. He was very clear-eyed, right? He sounded like your average person at a No Kings protest, and. Again, this is just sort of the logical conclusion of it. It's the same thing we talked about with the Southern Poverty Law Center. If there's a Nazi, if you really believe there's a Nazi at the end of your street who's trying to kill people, you might get violent with them, right? And here you go again. This guy was recognized as Teacher of the Month in his university. Not a guy hearing voices, right? Or who needs to be put into a padded room. Like this is a sort of standard lefty who just was following out what the standard lefty rhetoric would lead you to.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what concerned me most about what he wrote in his letter and what was reported on it was, he claimed Christianity.
Right.
And then where I found the most disconnect was in his arguments against tenets of the Bible. Like he would make a claim about what the Bible said and then say, well, no, this is why this is true in this case. And it's why we've got to be so wise as Christians, and we have to understand what's going on in our college classrooms, because if you know what Marxism teaches, you heard him overlapping Marxism with Bible and like trumping the Bible with cultural Marxism. Oh,
you saw that. That's such a good point, Mike, because you saw that in him justifying like, hey, I'm not trying to kill innocent people. I'm not even trying to kill security. But if you get in my way, then you kind of have it coming. What kind of Christian ethic is that?
Yeah.
Right? Like, I mean, that's pure Marxist ethic, right? Again, that's my that's one of the things I'll talk about, especially with college students, of like, the opposite of communism isn't capitalism. The opposite of communism is Christianity, because Christianity is a radical belief in the value of the individual, whereas communism is a belief purely in the collective. And so Christianity teaches, Jesus taught us that you leave the 99 to pursue the one. The one value, it matters so much that you're even willing to leave those to go get that one life. Communism teaches that you kill the one to protect the 99, right? Or in this case, you kill the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to protect the rest. And that is that's that unholy, as you just described him, like that unholy mixture you're seeing in American culture today, and on the left. I mean, this is, again, we don't need to spend too much time on this. Christians, please stop the both sidesism. Like, yes, there are big problems on the right and conservatives, and we've covered that here. We'll continue to cover it, but to act like the scale of the problems on the right are remotely close to the scale of the evil that's on the left today is really just virtue signaling and self-serving, and you're not actually helping deal with the monumental problems we have today.
Yeah, and some of this, I have to wonder, some of what we're seeing from the left is just they sense kind of that grip slipping away, and that was reflected in a Supreme Court decision that came down this week, a 6-3 decision. The Supreme Court ruled that racial gerrymandering, that was used to create a lot of black congressional districts for decades, that's actually unconstitutional. And Justice Alito wrote the majority opinion on that. So tell us a little bit about that case, Aaron, and why it's so important.
Yeah, again, this is one of these cases that's righting a wrong, almost as long-standing as the Roe, obviously not as sort of devastating in terms of lives lost, but certainly in terms of impact, this is a huge one. This is really writing a Voting Rights Act decision from the 1980s that created this sort of super, what I would call racist, but a super standard for how states need to draw their congressional districts, right? And they took the 1960s Voting Rights Act, which we think is generally a good law. Its interpretation has just been abused. And I want to read specifically Section 2, because it's important to understand what the left did with the Voting Rights Act. Again, groups like CCV, conservatives, Justice Alito, Justice Thomas on the court would all probably say the Voting Rights Act is good policy. It's just been interpreted in a brutal way. And this is what judicial activism looks like. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act guarantees that minorities have an equal opportunity to participate in the political process and to elect representatives of their choice, right? So this is just sort of, this is a common thing we do in lawmaking, where you take the broad principle of, all men are created equal, right? You take those sort of broad equal protection claims, and then you say, hey, specifically what this means in this context is that everyone has equal opportunity to participate in the political process. So what does that mean? You can't create poll taxes, right? You can't set up voting locations only in predominantly white neighborhoods, right? You're not putting, you're making it so much more difficult for individuals to participate in the voting process. Well, what was done in this Gingell's 1986 Supreme Court case was they took this line of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and they reinterpreted it to say that states had to draw these lines, and they had to specifically draw what's called majority-minority, so majority either black or Latino districts, to prevent vote dilution. Vote dilution is nowhere in the Voting Rights Act. Vote dilution itself is a racist principle, because the concept of vote dilution, what they're trying to say is, hey, if we don't have districts where there's enough black people in there to vote a certain way, then their voice is being diluted. They're not getting the opportunity to participate in the process. Well, no, that what you're saying, first off, is you're saying all black people vote alike. If David Mahan were in here, he'd probably have something to say about that.
Kind of sad he's not for a change.
I know, right?
That would
Exactly,
have been a good David Mahan right there.
But number two, what you're also saying is that in those areas, the white votes don't matter, right? And that was actually, this lawsuit was brought by non-black voters saying, hey, like what you're trying to do to stop racism is in itself racist, because you're saying, one, all of these folks, they vote alike, and number two, because of the color of your skin, and we're going to force you into a district that where your vote's just not going to matter as much. Both of those things, massively unconstitutional. Both of those things have been used for the past 30 years to lead to congressional district maps that are completely nonsensical. It's one of the number one reasons you see those weirdly drawn districts that show up in states. And big picture on this, Mike, like because this decision is coming down so late in the election cycle, it's going to be hard for, especially even Louisiana. They vote in 2 weeks. It's going to be hard for states like Louisiana to fix these gerrymandered maps that were drawn unconstitutionally in line with this bad interpretation of the Voting Rights Act. But states like Florida and others are already redrawing, and certainly when we do go through this again in 2030, this is a really good sign of we're actually going to have fair districts in America.
Yeah, and I'm even thinking it's not specific to this, but you look at what Virginia just did or tried to do. I know it's facing some legal challenges, but essentially taking all of that suburban DC population and trying to pull it out into rural Virginia and creating just an entirely blue map. And when you overlay what the districts were previously based on like who voted Republican and Democrat, what they had was actually pretty close to what you would expect as being representative of the population of Virginia. And now they're just drawing all this blue out into predominantly red areas in an attempt to rig the system.
Right. And this is the one thing I will say about that is, again, I think those maps were ridiculous. I think if the voters of Virginia get another shot at it, they might actually repeal that. But drawing political maps is the most political thing you can do.
We talked about this when we had our referendum.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. This is so. As much as I hate what Virginia did, there is a distinction between what Virginia did and this decision, right? Because this
interpretation of the law.
Exactly. Yeah. This was an interpretation of the law that they were using to supersede a political process, a process put in place by the voters, right? And so they were saying, hey, yeah, voters, you want this, but now a handful of judges are going to stop you from doing what you want.
Exactly.
Again, I think the Virginia situation is bad. I don't know what the nature of, I believe their lawsuit is a state lawsuit. And so it could still get overturned, and I hope it does, both for practical political reasons, but if the law's on our side, I want that as well. In this situation, there is a part of it which is, listen, no matter what we try to do with drawing political maps, ultimately what it comes back to is are the people drawing the maps accountable to the voters? And in Ohio, as you talked about, we've talked about this on the podcast before, in Ohio, we have actually a pretty good accountable process that ensures that. And hopefully now this Supreme Court decision will allow those people to do what they were elected to do.
Yeah. Well, it's been a good conversation on all the news from this past week. We've got a really interesting interview for you today with Benjamin Baird, who is the director of the Middle East Forum. I didn't get to participate in this interview because you got us working pretty hard here in the communications
from time to time. Comms has some things going on,
but he's done a lot with Islam in politics, and specifically done some reporting here in Ohio about maybe some ties to the Muslim Brotherhood that are
definitely
in the Ohio General Assembly. So this is an interesting conversation with Benjamin Baird. We're happy to bring it to you, and it's coming up next on The Narrative.
If you've got something to say, We want to help you say it. I'm Vince Tornero. Since 2018, Wessler Media has helped churches, organizations, and events amplify their message through podcast, video, and social media. We also happen to produce the narrative too. Let's talk. WesslerMedia.com. WESSLER Media.com.
Pastors today are constantly pressured to stay out of politics, even as their congregations face confusing cultural issues that can only be navigated with solid biblical wisdom. Hi friends, Nick Spencer here, director of CCV's Tom Menery Fellowship for Cultural Engagement. The Tom Menery Fellowship helps pastors understand the times and shepherd their churches with foundational truths from Scripture. This program brings pastors together in regional cohorts where they gain biblical insight, practical guidance, and the confidence to speak wisely into today's unique challenges. Ohio pastors can join a community of leaders committed to courage, clarity, and connection. Learn more and apply today at MeneryFellowship.org or click the link in the show notes for more information.
Welcome back to The Narrative. Aaron Baird, David Mahan, jumping in with a new friend to the program, Benjamin Baird, who is a public affairs specialist who organizes grassroots advocacy campaigns in support of Middle East forum projects. He mobilizes constituencies to support MEF policy objectives, coordinates effective public pressure campaigns, and uses bold and creative techniques to disrupt the policymaking arena. Mr. Baird is a U.S. Army infantry veteran with a BA from American Military University. His writings can be found in National Review, New York Post, Jerusalem Post, and other prominent media outlets. I got to say, I have been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time because of something that we saw published from you, Benjamin, in The Federalist, and super grateful for your work, and thanks for joining us on The Narrative.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, I want to just read the first two paragraphs from this article that you published in The Federalist back in February, because it shines some light on things, even for individuals who spend time at the State House, we didn't even know about really the growth of Islamism here in Ohio. That is reflective of things we're seeing across the country. So in your February 20th, 2026 article titled Unmasking Muslim Brotherhood Ties Inside Ohio's Legislature, you wrote in The Federalist, in a highly anticipated move, the Trump administration designated factions of the global Muslim Brotherhood as terrorist organizations last month, an executive action with profound implications extending beyond the Middle East to America's heartland. Astonishingly, a Somali-American legislator from Ohio State, Representative Munira Abdullahi from Columbus, continues to serve as a national leader for the Muslim American Society, MAS, a registered nonprofit with federal prosecutors have identified as the overt arm of the Muslim Brotherhood in America. Abdullahi's involvement with MAS dates back to at least 2012, when she served as a youth director in Columbus and as a national program director. The organization's youth programs have been marred by scandals nationwide, including an incident in Philadelphia where children were taught songs about beheading Israeli Jews and a fundraiser selling merchandise glorifying Hamas and Hezbollah terrorists. Upon her election into public office in 2022, Abdullahi appeared to distance herself from MAS, updating her LinkedIn profile to indicate she no longer worked for the group. However, her ties persisted and deepened. Benjamin, thanks so much for bringing this to light. Can you just start with who the Muslim Brotherhood is, why they got this designation from the Trump administration, and why we should be so concerned about anyone with ties to the Muslim Brotherhood?
Absolutely. That's a great place to start. The Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamist organization. And when we say Islamist, we're referring to a political ideology that's, around 100 years old. It is a totalitarian, extreme expression of the Islamic faith. I won't get into saying how many Muslims are Islamists and non-Islamists, but there's quite a few. When you talk about violent jihadists, for instance, these are Islamists, but there are also politically quietist strains of Islamism, folks who work in the West or in Western countries to to take over our democratic institutions and to use them against us, to use things like freedom of speech and our Judeo-Christian values, and to reverse them and take advantage of our hospitality, and use them against us in a seemingly lawful way, but using a strategy that in many ways is just as effective as violent terrorism for spreading the Islamic faith. The Muslim Brotherhood is probably one of the most foremost popular Islamist movements to arise. It started in Egypt back in the 1920s. Muslim Brotherhood movements are known for using social welfare programs. So for things like humanitarian aid, colleges, after school programs, feeding the poor, things that on the surface appear very good. That's how they go about spreading their religion. And that's what the Muslim Brotherhood did in Egypt for many years. However, there are many radical expressions within the Muslim Brotherhood. In 2013, Mohammed Morsi rose to power in Egypt and quickly clamped down and enforced his radical version of Islam upon the people of Egypt, and was subsequently overthrown as a result. And this is what happens when these Islamists tend to come to power. We've seen it in other capitals across the Middle East, and it's certainly true for the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. Now, back in the 1960s, the Muslim Brotherhood started spreading in America, first through student movements, but then it grew to take on media arms, political advocacy type of work, community organizations, the whole gambit of nonprofit NGOs here in the United States. And the most extant expression here in the U.S. of the Muslim Brotherhood is a group called the Muslim American Society, which you referred to there in the opening paragraph of the article. And Munira Abdullahi is a part of this.
So, Benjamin, could you maybe give some broad defining characteristic of Islamism compared to maybe just general Islam? Is there clear distinctions there, or what would be core beliefs of an Islamist and somebody who's in the Muslim Brotherhood?
Right, great question. Islamists generally want their faith to dominate all aspects of life, whether other people want it or not. So the social, certainly the political, they want an Islamic state. Ultimately, it's a theocratic worldview that makes no space for other worldviews. When you look at Islam itself, this is a diverse religion with many sects, many factions. You have Sufis who believe in a sort of mystical version of Islam. You have the basic two sects, which are the Sunnis and Shia, who have various beliefs about the leadership of Islam. And so it's a multi-varied faith, whereas Islamism, they generally just believe in dominating social life and political life through religious imposition.
My confusion here, with the Islamist piece and Rep. Abdullahi, to my understanding is that like the trans movement, right, where you can change your sex, you can just be a female if you want to be a female today and not be a female tomorrow. Generally, this would not be a part of the message that they're trying to spread all across the planet. But here, we see her voting against the bathroom bill that would protect women's private spaces. We see her voting against other bills that would protect women, even though she sits as a chair for the Democrat caucus for where champion women's rights and things like that. Where is that break? How do you justify, if this is a movement to politicize and make everybody line up with their worldview? Surely this isn't part of their worldview. So how's that work?
Right. That's a great question. So here in the West, in the United States, Islamists have teamed up to a great extent with the left, in many cases with Marxist and very far left extreme movements. And so you look at people even like Ilhan Omar, who is the congresswoman out of Minnesota, very much like Munira Abdullahi, who has been pictured with, members of the trans movement. The best way I have of explaining this is what you've heard directly from certain Islamists. They are using this as a marriage of convenience. They are aligning with the left and accepting some of these, less than optimal, non-conservative political views in order to advance their own views. And so recently you've had a number of Muslims across America sort of reject the leftist influence within the Muslim community. You saw this during Trump's election with a number of Muslims in Michigan voting for President Trump. They've kind of gotten fed up with it. And people like Ilhan Omar have faced challenges to remain in power as a result of holding on to some of those leftist values, which many Islamists reject. And so there's always, I think, a fine line between the leftist beliefs of certain politicians and Islamist beliefs and how they coincide. I think at the heart of both of these is anti-Americanism, generally anti-Israel beliefs. In many ways, there can be anti-Christian values that some of these folks express. But it's very much about getting to the next level. Right now, they realize that they're a minority. They're not going to tomorrow establish an Islamic State in the U.S. And so they need political access. And they're not getting that from the right, who is more suspicious, I think, of Islamist infiltration in society. And so they work on the left side, and that's how they've gained access to positions of power. Munira, Congress, members of the Biden administration, for instance.
Very interesting, because in that, that battle that's being waged between one side and the other on some of these progressive policies, I saw play out at the State House. I'm standing a couple years ago in the House chamber, and there was a member of the Democrat caucus who just got blown up over, these bills that I just mentioned, dealing with the whole trans movement. And they're like, what gives? Are you guys not for this kind of thing? And she found out, okay, they're for it in the State House, but they're not necessarily for it, in the population, but she comes from a district where there's about 60,000 Somalis in that community. So my question to you would be like, you look at like a Dearborn, Michigan, right? One in areas where they've gained power, where do they stand on some of these controversial progressive issues within their own groups?
Yeah, that's another really good question. We've kept close tabs not only on Dearborn, but Hamtramck throughout the years. And if you look at a city like Hamtramck, Michigan, this is where you see Sunni expressions of Islam mostly. You have a Yemeni and you have a Bangladeshi community. Years ago, the locals there, who are very left-leaning, allowed them to, for instance, the call to prayer is heard 5 times daily as early as 4:30 in the morning, blasted on loudspeakers at one of the 7 or 8 mosques that are in this small enclave in the middle of Detroit. And then sometime around 2021, it became an all-Muslim city council. And immediately they started enforcing anti-gay type of policies, or at least things that were perceived that way by the locals. They didn't allow the pride flag. Or at least not as a public symbol. But then they did things that were, I think, a lot worse. They allowed animal sacrifices in people's backyards, and they started getting rid of any non-Muslim government workers in City Hall. And they imposed this all quite quickly under a leader there named Mayor Amr Ghalib, who, in fact, was just appointed to be the Kuwaiti ambassador from the U.S., a Trump appointee. But he lost, thanks in part to some of his social media posts, which we revealed, which included, anti-Black bigotry, anti-Jewish bigotry, anti-Christian bigotry. This guy, I mean, he made just about anyone you can insult, he had insulted on his social media. So we exposed that years ago. And then back in October, when his confirmation hearing came up, he was exposed for all of those things. But it's not just his personal views. He very quickly enacted those things locally. They renamed a street Palestine Avenue, for instance, and they immediately passed a resolution blaming Israel for genocide. And so you see when they are in power, when they do have a majority, that they very quickly start pushing many of these radical reforms.
So I think, Benjamin, one of the things that jumped out in your story for me was really how deep the Muslim Brotherhood ties were here in Ohio. And I want to read another section after you detail the campaign contributions that Abdullahi got from the Muslim American Society. You go on to write about this group in Ohio. Housed in a Northside mosque serving Columbus's booming Somali immigrant community, MAS Columbus has long been a hub for Muslim Brotherhood figures. Its development owes much to Salah Sultan, who later joined Mohammed Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood regime in Egypt and is now imprisoned there for inciting violence. So that guy's coming from Ohio. Under Sultan's influence, the chapter's website hosted virulently anti-Semitic content declaring the evil within Jews is beyond description. Other prominent visitors include Sheikh Mohammed Jabril, the supreme guide of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, who is banned from preaching in Egypt. Abdullahi's crowning achievement as a Sharia-savvy legislator came in August 2025 with Mascon Cebus, her organization's inaugural convention held in Ohio State Capitol. She spoke alongside some of America's most extremist Islamist figures, including Osama Abdurshade, leader of the American Muslims for Palestine, and a radical anti-Israel group under state and federal scrutiny for its alleged origins as a Hamas front. Can you tell us a little bit, Benjamin, about the connection between some of these mosques we see not just through Ohio, but across the country, and the Muslim Brotherhood all over the world, or some of these more extremist groups in parts of the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, we track at the Middle East Forum about 5,000 Muslim organizations in the United States. And of those, a large majority we have defined as to be Islamist, part of various factions. The Muslim Brotherhood, through MAS, controls quite a few mosques, the Columbus Mosque being just one example. They also control a public affairs wing. Down in Texas, they have a fairly large mosque with an associated social welfare organization. They also have clinics, schools. It's quite a big organization. And some of these mosques that have been around for many years and have long ago been shown to foment extremism, to be really cesspools of radicalization, still exist today. Where I'm located now in Northern Virginia, there's a mosque called Dar al-Hijra. This mosque hosted as a lead imam Anwar al-Awlaki, who was killed in a 2010 drone strike. He was the top recruiter of Al-Qaeda. Nidal Hassan was the shooter down in Fort Hood. He was also a member of that mosque. 2 of the 9/11 hijackers spent time at this mosque. 3 or 4 of the board members and spiritual leaders from this mosque, Dar al-Hijra, have been arrested or deported for terrorism-related offenses. And there's radical mosques like this all across the country. There's the Bridgeview Mosque in Chicago. This is another Muslim Brotherhood front mosque that has its own charities, 3 charities which were shut down post 9/11 for funding terrorism. And it's quite incredible, I think, that many of these mosques still exist. There hasn't, in the last, I'd say, 15 years, been a very strong effort to try to police domestic Islamist terrorism here in the United States. There was a big push after 9/11. You had things like the Holy Land Foundation case down in Texas the biggest terror finance case in U.S. history that caught Hamas activists here in the United States funneling $12 million to the Holy Land to fund terrorism. You had investigations all across the country. You had Operation Green, I believe it's Green Quest here in Virginia, to shut down a massive Al-Qaeda/Hamas conglomerate of nonprofits, businesses, think tanks, colleges. But they all sort of dissipated after when Obama came into power. He shut down some of the active investigations, and they never really picked back up. We were hoping post October 7th to see some of these mosques get closely investigated, and they didn't. And one of the reasons for this is because there was a great push from the Islamist organizations themselves, the ones that claim to be civil rights organizations. There was a huge push to say that when for instance, NYPD surveilled mosques in New York City, that they did so arbitrarily. They just picked them because they were Muslim. There was no real reason to take a look at these groups. And so it became a civil rights concern. It became a PR battle. And I hate to say it, but the Islamists won that battle. And as a result, our government, our law enforcement has been very hands-off over the years.
Yeah. Obviously we're seeing, issues with the Somali childcare facilities. We actually are doing our own little investigation here in Ohio. Help us with the paper trail, Benjamin. Like how I know that they tend to want to look at social services, education, food programs. What is the paper trail? Help us follow the money there.
Well, it's very interesting. Years ago, Middle Eastern money was infused into American Islamist groups, right? The money came from the Middle East, from places like from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia, from all over the place. And they established a ton of mosques, a ton of social welfare groups here in the U.S. Over time, as the scrutiny increased, that funding kind of slowed down. And what you see now, believe it or not, is that American Islamists are funding operations overseas now. So now the money's coming from the U.S. to fund overseas operations. And when you talk about the Somali fraud cases, for instance, they send a ton of money home in remittances, and it's really hard to track that money and make sure that it's not being diverted to terrorism. And that's a big concern. When this issue was first raised in Minnesota in 2019, the big takeaway was that, oh my gosh, this millions of dollars that they're scheming and taking from the state government could be used to fund Al-Shabaab and ISIS, other terrorist groups in Somalia. And I think that concern really hasn't dissipated. And in fact, the influence of American Islamism, not just financially, but they're setting the tone ideologically in many cases and influencing the way Islamists behave in the Middle East. And so, of course, that still is a threat to us. We have interests abroad just as we have them here. And they use their influence, their great wealth, to challenge U.S. authority, not only here, but overseas.
So, Benjamin, you talk about Benjamin Baird from the Middle Eastern Forum. You talk a lot about the PR campaign that Islamism is running in America. I think there's no better example of that or no stronger PR force for them than an organization that goes by CAIR, C-A-I-R, the Council on American Islamic Relations. They show up in the media regularly as a sort of a mainstream Muslim group, and they get portrayed as a middle of the road, westernized Muslim kind of position on Islam. But your reporting, and I think for anybody who has sort of looked under the hood, has seen the extremist ties there. Can you talk a little bit about who the Council on American Islamic Relations is, and why Americans should be so concerned about this organization?
Absolutely. CAIR is probably the most preeminent left-aligned Islamist group here in the United States. They are a front for Hamas. They were founded back in the mid 1990s. The founders were part of a group called the Islamic Association of Palestine, which was founded by Hamas officials. And the FBI were listening in to a 1993 secret meeting in Philadelphia, where they heard Hamas activists in the United States plotting to establish a media-friendly organization that had the veneer of moderation, to establish that group to promote Hamas, at least clandestinely. A year later, CARE was born, and it didn't take long. In the 2007 Holy Land Foundation trial, they were labeled as unindicted co-conspirators. There was a pretty tough case against CARE. Their names, the officials, they kept showing up in documents. Phone books for Muslim Brotherhood officials had their names in it. They would arrest Muslim Brotherhood officials in the United States, and they would have linkages to CARE officials in one way or another. Over time, 7 CARE officials have been arrested, convicted, or deported for terrorism-related offenses, most of them convicted. And these are for various terrorist movements, not just Hamas. Probably the most known of these is a man by the name of Ghassan Alashi. He was part of CARE Texas, and he was convicted in the Holy Land Foundation trial, sentenced to 65 years in prison. After October 7th, when you saw hostages, American hostages, Israeli hostages taken, Hamas actually bartered said, we'll give you back some of these American hostages if you release Ghassan Alashi, again, a former CARE official. And so they've had quite a bad track record. Most recently, in fact, the most recent, I think, Hamas link comes from CARE Ohio, from Khalid Turani, the executive director there. Turani hosted an online event recently where a Hamas specially designated national was one of the guests. Another guest was a convicted Palestinian Islamic Jihad financier by the name of Sami al-Arian, who was deported from the U.S. back in 2015. So CARE is very active across the country. They have 30 or so chapters. They have a Columbus, a Cleveland, a Cincinnati chapter. They're very active here in Ohio. They have an annual Muslim Advocacy Day where they visit the State House and lobby for their interests. And so, it's one of the biggest threats. I'm very proud to say that the Middle East Forum worked very closely in conceptualizing a bill with Representative Chip Roy in Texas that came out last week that directs the Treasury Department to designate CARE as a specially designated global terrorist organization. So hopefully we see some progress on that front.
So on that note, the terrorist designation, what other countries have designated, CARE or groups like them as terrorists, and why did it take America so long to do so?
It's very interesting that the Middle Eastern countries that understand the Muslim Brotherhood the most tend to have designations against the Muslim Brotherhood that it took the United States years to come out with. CARE themselves was designated by, and the Muslim American Society, in fact. Both were designated as terrorist organizations by the United Arab Emirates, small Persian Gulf country, back in 2014. Recently, the states of Texas and Florida designated CARE and the Muslim Brotherhood. They said that, these are terrorist organizations. We need to do something about them. Now, as well-meaning as these executive actions were in these states, in many ways, these were legislative executive experiments. Nobody had ever done a state-level designation of a domestic group like this before. And so as a result, the Florida executive order was overturned. But Florida very quickly then said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to introduce a bill now to establish, the statutory grounding to do state level designations. And they did that, and they passed the bill very quickly, and it was signed into law a week or two ago. And so you're seeing this not just abroad, but at the state level, people are fed up to the point where states are taking action on their own. Outside of the Middle East, I think Russia considers the Muslim Brotherhood to be a terrorist organization. There's other countries like Libya. Libya has a big Muslim Brotherhood problem, and their government has designated Muslim American Society officials here in the United States as terrorists. And so, it's taken us a while to catch up. The Trump administration is rolling out designations as we speak. Back in, I believe it was December or January, the first 3 Muslim Brotherhood factions were designated. It was Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan. There's a lot of discussion about the best way to go about designating the Muslim Brotherhood. You cannot just say the Muslim Brotherhood as an entire movement should be designated, because there are branches of that movement that are in fact nonviolent, belong to political parties. They may have objectionable views that we all hate, but they're not involved with terrorism. And as far as we can tell, they aren't coordinating anything anymore with Egypt. After 2013, the global connections between many of these Muslim Brotherhood countries has died down. But that doesn't mean that there aren't violent versions of it. And you see that in places like Lebanon, which has fired, the Muslim Brotherhood there has fired rockets at Israeli towns and cities. So those 3 were the first. And then a month or 2 ago, Sudan was added to the list. And my understanding from having conversations directly with officials in the National Security Council is that there are going to be more designations to follow. Both foreign, domestic, and European Muslim Brotherhood organizations will be designated in the future, I understand.
Benjamin, now, Middle East Forum is a non-sectarian organization, non-religious organization. We talked a little bit beforehand. You're a Christian. I think for a lot of Christians, this conversation can become uncomfortable because we have a call in Scripture to love our neighbor, to care about those around us, and especially if we see folks going through difficult situations. So again, you hear about the dire situation in Somalia, and it pulls on your heartstrings, and they sort of, I would say, manipulate, but they'll use that to say, oh, we need to have these broad refugee policies and bring as many folks in as possible. And again, it really does pull on the Christian's heart for kindness and gentleness and care. But when you hear stories like what you're saying, it really should cause us to pause and have a discussion about what this worldview really is. So for Christians out there, why is it that Islamism is not just some other worldview that is like, hey, it's fine to have this in our neighborhood or fine to have this in our community?
Just a religion.
It's just another religion. There's no difference between us and them. Why is this worldview particularly dangerous? And is it okay for us to say, actually, you know what? We don't want to be importing as much of this as physically possible, or we at least want to be willing to prosecute when these folks are crossing these lines?
Right. First of all, I think that people need to understand that Islamism and jihadism, it seeks to dominate, it seeks to take over society. I mean, if you read the Quran, there's so much in the Quran dedicated to going after the people of the book, as they're called many times, or Nazarenes as they're referred to. They're talking about Christians and Jews here, and they spend a huge time. At the time, Islam was in competition with these religions, and so they wanted to make it clear that you shouldn't work with non-Muslims. They are lesser. They can have their faith, but they have to pay this huge tax. They have to walk on the opposite side of the street and give you deference when you come by. And practicing Muslims today, many Islamists, still hold those conservative views, and they believe in a dhimmi society, and dhimmitude, as it's called, is the treatment of non-Muslims by Muslims in a subservient way. And so I think Christians need to understand that. Of course, people in need deserve help. There are Muslims who aren't devout Muslims, just as there are, sectarian Christians and Jews. There are Muslims who aren't Islamists. There are people who deserve help. I would just caution that the humanitarian aid sector in Muslim countries and here in the United States, the humanitarian aid groups that give to Muslim countries have in many ways been corrupted and are being used for ill means. And so you really need to do the research to look into, if you're ever going to give your money or your time to a specific country through an organization, to know who you're giving the money to. Because frankly, the top 5 biggest Islamic charities are all fraudulent, extremist, and bigoted, and anti-Christian in many ways.
Benjamin, I think I want to drill in even a little bit deeper here, because I think it was James Lindsay who I saw talk about this one time, about the Quran, and I believe his point was that Islamism takes the Quran literally the way, evangelicals, Christians like us, and Catholics, many Catholics too, take the Bible as the inerrant, infallible Word of God, right? So we take it all seriously and we try to live our life accordingly, right? James Lindsay was suggesting that Islamism approach the Quran in the same way. So there can be Muslims who are not Islamists, certainly, but in their cases, they're not interpreting the Quran literally as it's written, right? They would have different interpretations. They wouldn't take it all as the sort of the true sect. Would you agree with that assessment? Is that broadly true, that that's the defining? You could say a lot what you want about Islamism, but they are taking that holy book to them literally and seriously.
Yeah, I think that's very true, not just of the Quran, but the Sunnah, the life of Muhammad that's been passed down through oral traditions over the years, all the rules that were established. You're absolutely right. Islamists are taking it quite literally. They are not allowing for any interpretation or ijtihad, as they call it, based on changes in time, changes in moral practices. And so that's what they're getting. Yes, the Quran, there's much to object to when you read it. And that's a problem. I think Christianity, and I might make some Catholics upset here, but Christianity went through a reformation that Islamists never went through at all. And so they haven't done any of the modernizing and reforming that Christianity and Catholicism too, to be fair, have experienced over time. So, I think as a result, you get more people reading the straight by the book, ultra conservative version, puritanical, revivalist. There's so many movements, Islamist movements, that have popped up, especially the Salafi and Deobandi versions of Islam, that want very much to say, no, this is the infallible Word of God. You cannot change it at all. And the Bible has a lot of stories and lessons in it, but if you read the Quran, it's very much direct, in your face, saying this is allowed, this isn't allowed. There's no stories to draw conclusions from and your own interpretations. It's very much, these are the rules, and if you follow them differently, you're an apostate in many cases.
So, Benjamin Baird, we could spend a lot longer with you. We would love to have you back. We didn't get to talk about Iran, didn't get to talk about Israel, didn't get to talk about so many other topics that we're really interested in. So would love to have you back sometime. But before we let you go, 2 things. First off, for a state like Ohio or any community that's seeing similar things like we are seeing here with Representative Abdullahi, what should be done? How should voters be thinking about leaders like Representative Abdullahi and the Muslim Brotherhood and CARE in our communities today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what they need to do is get a hold of their state legislators when it comes to Abdullahi and it comes to the Muslim American Society. I haven't seen this anywhere else in the United States. An official who actually works for the most overt version of the Muslim Brotherhood is an elected official in Columbus, Ohio. And to tell you the truth, she's also my mother's representative. She lives in her community is almost 95% Somali, but there's a little finger from the district that goes up into more affluent areas, and my mother happens to live in that area. So very important, I think.
She was the only member of the General Assembly that did not condemn Hamas for the October 7th.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to call that out and to let your elected officials and state government know. They should follow in the path of Florida, Texas. Other states are now pushing their own legislation. Tennessee, we helped with the bill down there that would make it so that groups like CARE and MAS cannot register as nonprofits in the state. And so there's tons of legislative solutions. I have to tell you, though, as somebody who lobbies in D.C. and works with state governments quite a bit, when I pushed this issue of Munira Abdullahi to state officials, got very little interest or feedback from anyone. So, I would ask people maybe to reach out to their own representative and ask for Abdullahi to be censured unless she leaves the Muslim American Society.
Absolutely. And then last but not least, Benjamin, where should people connect with Middle East Forum, follow your work, and stay up to date of what's going on with your organization?
Yes, if you go to ME Forum, ME standing for Middle East, forum.org, you'll find our website. You can navigate to the action page if you want to go to the Middle East, the MEF Action Project, which is the project that I lead, where you can take part in letter writing campaigns, petitions. You can get active not just in fighting Islamism at the grassroots level, but also in supporting pro-American policies in the Middle East.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Narrative, presented by CCV and produced by Wessler Media. If you found today's episode insightful, leave us a review or rating and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We're your hosts, Mike Andrews, Aaron Baird, and David Mahan, and we'll see you next time on The Narrative.